Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I walk around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. It's a weird walk today. I dropped my kids off for the freshman experience. My son is a freshman. My daughter's a junior. She's helping with the local school doing their freshman orientation day they call the freshman experience, and they have juniors volunteering to show people around. And so my daughter and son are both there. So I dropped my son off at the school and left the car, gave him the car keys, left the car there, and then I'm walking home, and then they will drive home after class because I can't come pick them up because I am going to be in a meeting, and I normally would take a walk in the morning anyway. So it all works out. So that now that you know where I'm going and why, I thought I would talk about what I'm doing. So we're at 3 weeks before school starts, give or take, and there's a lot going on to get things ready. And so I am working on planning for the semester. I'm working on getting things ready for the people I supervise, working on getting things ready for myself, getting things ready for my class. It's all about planning. So I thought I would talk today a little bit about planning, the corollary to my favorite thing in gaming. If you're relatively new to the podcast, I may not have talked about this recently. I'll put some links in the show notes to places where I have. But my favorite feeling in gaming is, ooh, not quite enough. I'll say that again, ooh, not quite enough. The idea is that in some games, part of the ebb and flow of the game is that you get to a point where you want to do something and you can't because you don't have quite enough of whatever you need to do it. Maybe you don't have enough actions, maybe you don't have enough resources, maybe you don't have enough, well, it's usually actions and resources. Some combination of those usually makes for an interesting and delightful experience and shifts something from being kind of a normal, boring game to being a compelling game, in my experience. So, usually the way around getting crushed by that feeling or losing because of that is planning. And so today I thought I would talk about 4 designers whose work I really like and 2 games each of their oeuvre that I think point best to the kind of planning that helps you avoid the feeling of, oh, not quite enough. All right, so here we go. To start with, I want to leap right into the fray with perhaps the oldest school, I don't know, the best example of a designer whose work is all about planning and for whom, or when you're playing his games, you plan or lose. And this is Uwe Rosenberg. Now the 2 games I'll point to are the ones I talk about the most, Agricola and A Feast for Odin. If you don't know anything about those games, this isn't the place to learn. I'm not going to talk about those too much except for through the lens of planning. So both of these games involve a lot of thinking ahead, 2, 3, 4 turns, maybe 2, 3, 4 rounds to think about where are you trying to go and how do you plan to get there. Both games offer a variety of paths that you can take through what they offer to get you there. And it's in the nuances of that planning that you have to make your action work. Now the wrinkles or the challenges to the planning come from the fact that you don't have full access to everything on the board, that your opponents get in the way. Now in Agricola, that can be especially true. There is a constant push and pull about, do I leave that space one more turn and hope that I can get it next time and get 4 sheep instead of 3 sheep? Or do I take it now because my opponent will take it otherwise? I generally play more toward the mind of, I want to do well with the things I get more than I'm going to take something because you need it. But if I have an opponent who I just noticed has made a whole bunch of fences and there's a bunch of sheep just sitting around unclaimed, and I have some use for them, maybe I'll take them so that they don't get a free stockpile of sheep in their fences that they should have taken earlier or something like that. I usually won't do that though because I have something I was trying to do, and doing that during their turn is rough. Now with Agricola in particular, there is a feeding phase in which you have to feed your workers, and that part takes a significant amount of your energy, especially in the early rounds. And even in the later rounds, if you haven't built in a system to get that feeding going. Once you have a system, in some games I'm better at this than others. If you get if you get the baker occupation and you get a good supply of grain coming in, maybe you can bake bread every time or whatever to feed your people. But you have to include in your planning this sort of constant need to feed your people, the drying up of your resources due to food. And A Feast for Odin has a similar thing. You're still fighting with other players for worker placement spots, but there's a variety of different ways that you could complete your objectives. There is still a feeding phase, but it's generally more of a nuisance than a dramatic problem. Sometimes you'll notice just before the round is over, oh man, I don't have enough to feed them, and you have to use your last worker to go to one of the simple spots that gets you some dumb food thing that you didn't really want, but you need to make it all work. Some of those things are part of the game, but a little less fun. Anyway, so that's Uwe Rosenberg's oeuvre. The two games I think that require the most planning are Agricola and A Feast for Odin. Next up, we have Vital Lacerda. Vital Lacerda is someone whose games I have not played a lot of. He has several games that people would point to as really heavy planning games. The two that I've played, I think both very easily fit under this umbrella, and that's On Mars and The Gallerist. Both of these games involve immensely complex sets of resources and actions, and you have to execute them in a particular arrangement or a particular order so that you can resolve them in a way that will give you points. It can be particularly challenging to get all of these done in time, and again, like Uwe Rosenberg's work, The Gallerist and On Mars both turn on this notion of I don't have quite enough to do what I want. I'm really struggling to get it all done. One of the things that I've noticed that those two games do that Rosenberg's work tends to not do is to give you bonuses for doing things. So The Gallerist often has an element, and this is not entirely untrue. Some of this is in Agricola or A Feast for Odin also, but it's much more prominent in Vital Lacerda's work, where you're building up sort of mini engines that will drive the movement as the game goes on. So you get a kind of acceleration of benefits. Boy, now that I put it that way, it does sound, that is a thing in Agricola for sure. A Feast for Odin a little bit, but maybe a little less so, depending how you tackle it. In Vital Lacerda's work, it's crucial to think about like, which benefit am I gonna buy and how's that benefit gonna pay off later down the road. And we see a little of this in something like Bonfire as well, the Stefan Feld game, although I'm not talking about Stefan Feld as one of my four here. I probably could. His games are also a lot about planning, but I didn't put him on my list, so screw Feld. But yeah, so Vital Lacerda, I would say, requires more planning than Uwe Rosenberg to a degree, in that it feels like Rosenberg, there's often a couple paths forward from wherever you are. And Lacerda often, if you have a thing planned that you want to do and you can't do it, then you just have to stop and go back and do the thing that sets you up to do the thing you wanted to do. It's more restrictive in that way. And I think it's fun, but a little more brain burning in that regard. So those are Vital Lacerda's games, The Gallerist and On Mars in particular, although my understanding is Lisboa and Weather Machine also have those kinds of experiences. I'm not aware of Escape Plan and how that fits into this overall oeuvre. That game was not as widely heralded or received, so it's hard for me to say how that game fits in. All right, the next designer I want to point to are Richard Amann and Victor Peter, and I would say to a degree David Turczi as well, although David Turczi designs for a lot of different companies and a lot of different games, whereas Victor Peter and Richard Amann focus specifically on, there are some of the founders of Mind Clash games, and their games have this flavor to them, where, like Lacerda, there is a building up of requirements in order to accomplish things. And I would point here to the two games that I think involve the most planning, Trickerion and Cerebria. Now I would say Anachrony also requires a lot of planning, but in Anachrony there are so many different ways that you can move or things that you can pursue that you have a lot of options open to you at any given time. And then because the interaction with the opponents is so strident in that one, you really have to respond to how your opponents are interacting. And that's sort of true in Trickerion as well, that when your opponents go and do something, it affects what you're going to do. But at the beginning of the round, you can see what everyone's going to do. You can see where everyone's going to go, and you can kind of math out, okay, I'm going to get to do this. I'm probably not going to get to do that. You can kind of plan your round better. Anachrony, it's a bit more free-flowing and tactical. Now, arguably, you could say that Cerebria is free-flowing and tactical as well. In fact, Cerebria might be the most tactical of the Mind Clash games because you have to respond to the way that your opponents have set up their board. That said, Cerebria to me also feels like a game where you have to put in place 2-3 turns ahead what you want to do so that you're going to be able to execute your long-term goals. And you have to react to what your opponent's doing as well, but it's the mix of those two that I find really compelling. Cerebria also has more than almost any other game, the intense need to look at the variety of options available to you and figure out how you're going to use your 3 or 4 actions on your turn and in what order. Because there's so much complexity available in the different maneuvers you're going to make, it creates a really intense decision space that I think is fantastic and well worth the cognitive load of learning the game, which is not. So I guess that's why I would say I think Cerebria feels like a game that demands more planning, even though you could easily put Anachrony in here, and I wouldn't argue with you. I've only played a few minutes of Septima, so I can't really speak to that one yet. And Perseverance is still too new for me to be able to comment more elaborately on that. So that is Cerebria, The Inside World, and Trickerion, Masters of Illusion. I don't remember what the subtitle of Trickerion is, something like that. And then finally, there is Vladimir Suchý. Now, Vladimir Suchý is, of course, one of my favorite designers, probably neck and neck with Martin Wallace most of the time. And Vladimir Suchý has really elaborate games with lots of systems piled onto them, lots of different mechanisms going on, lots of different ways to think about how things are going to interact, and lots of different ways to score points. Because of that, Suchý is sort of the opposite of Lacerda in terms of he gives you this expansive playground to work in, and everything you're going to do is get you points. And while there will be times definitely where you're like, oh, I really want to do that, but I don't have quite enough resources to do that, you almost always find something that you can do that makes you feel better about your current board state. His last couple games, Underwater Cities and Praga Caput Regni, offer a piling on of resource generating material so that as the game goes along, you get more and more stuff to work with, and then you can pursue the points more and more elaborately. I really like that. But you still need to have a general goal, be that end game scoring points for different goals that you capture. Like in Underwater Cities, you get a special card with a particular end game scoring objective. You want to grab that, and then you can build your board toward that. There's also a couple public end game scoring objectives that you can see. There's also ones that you could hit that have to do with the cities that get distributed onto your board, or a variety of other things. The same goes for Praga Caput Regni. That one, a key part of the planning has to do with looking at the tiles that are coming down the row and trying to think about which tiles are your opponent's going to take. But again, a wide enough decision space that even if you get stuck with a tile you don't really want, you often can feel like you had a good turn, or an interesting turn at least. So from that regard, I think both Praga Caput Regni and Underwater Cities offer an immense opportunity for really interesting planning, and that's why I find them so compelling, and I'm so keen to see what they do, which is why I really enjoy Vladimir Suchý games as well. Now, of course, there are a couple people on here that I didn't mention. Martin Wallace I didn't mention. I don't generally feel like Martin Wallace's games demand a ton of planning, with the exception of Brass. I find Brass to be very brain-burning and crunchy, but most of the other games are more tactical. Nanty-Narking or London. These are games that involve some planning, but often responding to the situation on the ground, the tactics, more than the strategy. So that brings me to the end of my discussion about planning. I'm curious to hear, dear listener, what do you think of when you think of board games that demand that you do a lot of planning? Which are your favorite games for planning? Why are they your favorite games for planning? How are they your favorite games for planning? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know your thoughts on games about planning. You can join the guild there. You could also direct message me. Wombat929 is my username. Or you could send me a message by email. Brendan@rattleboxgames is that address. Or finally, you could join me on one of the asynchronous board gaming platforms, Board Game Arena, Boîte à Jeux, or Yucata.de. I'm available on all three with the username Wombat929. I would love to play a game with you. So send me an invite, send me a friend request. Let me know you listen to the show, because that's fun. We also have a show community on Board Game Arena. So if you want to play with other members of the show, or other people who listen to the show, you can do that there. If you're looking for another way to support the podcast, you could post a review or tell someone else that you know about the podcast. That's a good way to grow it. Or finally, I am also a board game designer and a partner at XYZ Game Labs. And so another way to support the show would be to order one of our games. We have the knitting themed game Arch Ravels, and we have currently on pre-order right now Bigfoot Roll and Smash, which is a game about monster trucks that is frankly amazing, and I'm really excited to show it to people. Check out the Gen Con coverage of Bigfoot Roll and Smash if you want to see some glimpses into that. All right, enough commercial work for today. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.